Hi, in previous episodes, we talked about getting your motorcycle ready for the season and preparing your bike for motorcycle trips, for longer motorcycle journeys. Today, we're going to tackle much more difficult topics. We'll be dealing with situations where the motorcycle stalls, won't start, your plans fall apart, and you're left to fend for yourself. You'll learn a few methods, some tricks, and a couple of tips for starting your motorcycle in pretty tough situations. Surely, many mechanics will cringe at the thought of some of these tricks, but let's remember that these are actions for emergency situations, ones we didn't plan for, and our main goal is simply to get the motorcycle started and keep going. One of the most common malfunctions in motorcycles, and I honestly don't know why, is a failure of the side stand sensor. What are the symptoms? The symptom is that after starting the motorcycle in neutral, when you shift into first gear, the motorcycle stalls, and this situation will keep repeating. In order to ride, unfortunately, we have to either disconnect the sensor or simply replace it. But if that's not possible, we need to disconnect it from the wiring. But here, there might be a surprise, because often just disconnecting it might not help at all. In this motorcycle, we don't have that sensor, so such a malfunction will never occur. However, 95% of motorcycles, if not more, are equipped with this sensor. Therefore, if the motorcycle stalls when you put it into first gear, we need to find the side stand sensor, trace the electrical wire that goes into the system, and locate the connector that connects the sensor wire to the rest of the wiring. The first thing we do is disconnect that connector and try to start the motorcycle. If the bike starts, there's no problem. We can keep going, just remembering that the sensor isn't working. So we need to pay special attention not to ride off with the side stand down, because that could result in a fall. But of course, we have to remember that often, even after disconnecting the sensor, the motorcycle still won't start. That's why we need to trace the wiring again, unplug the connector, and bridge the two pins that are sticking out here, so connect them together. To bridge the connection, we can use a screwdriver, insert it between the pins, and see if the engine starts. We can use a piece of wire, a coin, really anything at all, as long as it connects them. Even in a critical situation, if you don't have any metal object nearby, you can bend the pins, twist them together, and then the device should start. Another malfunction happens very often during expeditions, during travel. We put a load on the electrical system with various devices, navigation, a phone, additional fog lights or heated grips, which simply give us comfort when riding in cold conditions. But all of this significantly affects the power drawn from the battery, especially if we're charging a phone with the engine turned off. In the morning, the motorcycle won't start. I'm talking about camping conditions, the motorcycle won't start, and well, that's a problem. What can we do about it? Of course, it's great if we have a meter and can check the voltage in the battery. The voltage should be above 12 volts, definitely above 11 volts. In that case, the machine should start. But it often happens that you turn the starter, press the starter button, the electric motor begins to spin, starts turning the crankshaft, and yet the motorcycle still doesn't start. Very often, it's also the case that the battery provides too little current for the entire system to put it simply, supplied with enough electricity for the engine to start. The starter will consume all the stored power from the battery, and the spark plug will produce too weak a spark for the engine to start. And then, quite simply, if we keep cranking for longer, we'll drain the battery, and the motorcycle definitely won't start. What should you do in such situations? It's definitely worth charging the battery with a charger if that's possible. Of course, we have to take into account that we're traveling, we're away from home, and we're not in conditions where we can do this, so it's good if we have jumper cables with us. How do you use jumper cables to start a motorcycle correctly and minimize risk? Let me show you. Quite fortunately, it turned out that in the trunk, in the bag, or in the neighbor's top case, in the neighbor's motorcycle, we had jumper cables. Jumper cables are very simple to use. They are two-colored, so the red cable is always positive, and the black one is negative. Of course, if you do it the other way around, nothing will happen. However, on both sides, you need to connect positive to positive and negative to negative. And this is the most important note. The second point is that you should always connect the positive to positive first, and then the negative, and not necessarily to the negative terminal, but to the motorcycle frame. The point is that with a heavily discharged battery in the motorcycle, at the very moment of connecting, there will be a lot of sparking, because the motorcycle will draw a significant amount of current. The battery will, to put it simply, draw current from the battery that is working properly, so there will be sparking. That's why we connect the negative terminal to a steel part of the motorcycle, for example, right here. It could be here. It could also be on a bolt of the engine. It's important that this part is unpainted, that it's exposed so that the current can flow. Why do we do it this way? Precisely because there is sparking, and during heavy charging or high current draw, the battery emits very explosive gases, and this could simply end badly. That's why we should minimize this risk and connect the second cable away from the battery. We also need to remember that the motorcycle we're borrowing power from should be turned off. Of course, there are two schools of thought here. One says that the motorcycle should be turned off to minimize the risk of damaging the electrical system in the receiving motorcycle. But there's also the other side of the coin. A motorcycle that's turned off won't be charging its battery. So if the issue is something other than just a dead battery in the motorcycle that needs a jump, it's easy to drain the battery in the donor, motorcycle donor, recipient, donor, recipient, donor. Now imagine a situation where you don't have this component. This happens very often, and probably every time this problem occurs, you won't have jumper cables with you. So let's forget about them. Now we have to start the motorcycle by push starting it. How do you do that? Logic suggests that you should tie the rope somewhere at the front and to the towing motorcycle, which of course you need somewhere at the back. But no, you mustn't do it this way, because the higher the rope is attached to the motorcycle, the more the motorcycle will sway from side to side. Towing and pulling will simply be more difficult. Many guys on the internet that you'll find will show that you should tow using the foot pegs, the sets. Why? Because this is a very low mounted part of the motorcycle, so it practically won't affect the motorcycle's side-to-side tilting, and this method is simply the easiest. On the left side, we tie the rope to the towed motorcycle, and on the right side, on the other side, to the towing motorcycle. So the towing motorcycle is on this side, and the towed motorcycle is on this side. We accelerate to a speed of, let's say, 30 kilometers per hour. We remember to use the red kill switch button, so-called, and switch it to the ignition position. We turn on the ignition and shift into second gear. And now the most important part. Before you release the clutch and start turning the engine, the crankshaft with the rear wheel, you need to jump firmly onto the rear seat. So you jump, you bounce, land on your butt, the suspension compresses, and it presses the rear wheel down much harder than in the normal position. And then you release the clutch. And I won't hide it, experience is quite important here. First, so that the motorcycle doesn't shoot forward and hit the towing bike. And experience is also important so you don't put the motorcycle into a skid. And remember, this method is somewhat risky. It's easier for me to talk about this because I grew up with old motorcycles that almost always started by push starting, and there was always a problem starting them with the Kickstarter, since back then on the bikes I started riding, there was no electric starter, so it's easier for me. However, if you don't feel experienced enough, don't have the skills, or are afraid you might damage the equipment, don't try to push start or tow start the bike. There's always a way out of the situation. Sometimes it's worth waiting. Sometimes it's better to call a friend who can come with a trailer, pick you up from the road, and take you home safely. So ultimately, it's all up to you. You're responsible for how you start your motorcycle and what you do with it afterwards. Okay, we've checked and we're sure that the battery is charged, the starter is turning, but the motorcycle won't start, not even when push started. So we've ruled out the possibility of an electrical installation fault, and now we should move on to the next steps to eliminate other possible failures. First, we check the fuses. This is the most important thing, often overlooked not only by users, but also by mechanics who service motorcycles. You're really looking for a problem where there isn't one, and it turns out the repair costs just 15 cents and takes 30 seconds to fix. The motorcycle won't start, so we need to check whether fuel and air are reaching the engine and whether we have a spark at the spark plug. I suggest checking for a spark first, because that way we won't have time to spill gasoline on the engine and the risk of setting our own motorcycle on fire will be lower. Of course, everything is great if we don't have to remove the fuel tank to unscrew the spark plug, or if we have a spare spark plug with us. In that case, there's no problem. We check and we already know the answer. Unfortunately, we have to take off the tank to get to the spark plug. It's a bit more work, but that's good because I'll show you from start to finish how it should look. It's a good idea not to lose those screws, and especially the rubber washers, because it'll be very hard for you to buy replacements, and they're what keep the tank from vibrating and making noise. So I unscrew them and take the whole part with me, and there's no problem. Now we need to remove the fuel line. In this motorcycle, it's not a problem because we can just turn off the fuel tap. Often in motorcycles, especially Asian ones, the fuel tap is attached to the frame. So if we remove the hose from the tap, fuel from the tank will keep pouring out. So you need to unscrew the tap from the frame. And if that's not possible, for some reason, you can unscrew a bolt from some part, preferably a 6mm bolt on, insert it, put a clamp on the hose, and the fuel won't flow anymore. Unfortunately, the rubber hose that's on the petcock is already old, it's cracked, and very hard, so it will be difficult to take it off. But I hope we'll manage to do it in a moment. We did it. The tank didn't, the motorcycle itself didn't get too much fuel on it, and we can remove the tank. Now we have the engine exposed. We also have the ignition coil exposed. There's nothing left for us to do but take it out, check if it's damaged or corroded here, because that could also cause ignition problems. Now we are looking for a spark plug wrench. Very often in motorcycle toolkits, the spark plug wrench is simply included in the set. If it's not there, in motorcycles, it's usually a 16, 17, or sometimes a 21. You need to check beforehand. I know you'll say, I'm kind of cheating because you probably don't have a magnet with you, but 2 screwdrivers are enough. If the spark plug is too deep, you can also take it out. We put the spark plug back into the cap and touch it to a steel or metal part. But the most important thing is that it shouldn't be painted. If the cylinder fins are painted, it's better to look for another spot. Here we have some screws that are perfect for this. Hold them in place, and even if you don't have anything to hold them with, you can just hold the cap like this, because voltage might jump here, and then you turn the starter. If you see a spark jump, it means that current is reaching the spark plug. So the ignition module is working, and the coil is functioning properly. Now we need to screw the spark plug back in, and that's a bit tricky because the thread in the cylinder head is quite delicate. That's why we drop the spark plug in and screw it in by hand almost all the way. We only use the wrench at the very end. We do this very gently. You really don't need any force here at all. Ideally, if you have a second new spark plug, that's best. There's always a note on the spark plug indicating how to screw it in. Sometimes it's specified by torque, sometimes by angle most often. Turning it twice by 90 degrees after hand tightening is enough for the spark plug to sit as it should, and then we tighten it gently with feeling. A slight resistance, just a little more, and that's enough. As you can see, the motorcycle still won't start. Probably because there's no fuel tank and there's no fuel left in the carburetor. But now we'll check if the real reason the motorcycle won't start is actually the lack of fuel. How do we do that? I'll show you right now. We get to the air filter so that we have access, and most importantly, so you can remove it. The last screw. The air filter is now exposed, and we've also got quite a mess on our hands. You just saw that the motorcycle wouldn't start because there was no fuel. But now we're going to try to start it, even though there's no fuel, so we need something flammable. Here we've got some brake disc cleaner. You could even use regular deodorant for this. We spray a little. Did you just see that? It has started. There is absolutely no fuel at all present in the carburetor. So what exactly does that mean for us? It means that fuel wasn't reaching the engine. And now we can get to work look for the reason why. Most often, it's a clogged filter or blocked main jet. What does the main jet look like? How do you unclog it? I'll show you right now. Granted, I'll be showing you on a different carburetor than this one because we won't be taking this one out, but inside, carburetors almost always look the same. Here we have a Mikuni carburetor, a very old one. Granted, it's already a bit broken, but that doesn't really matter, at least for educational purposes. So here we have the components we're talking about. Here we have the jet, which, if the engine behaves like it did a moment ago, is dirty or clogged. So to unclog it, we first need to unscrew it with a screwdriver, sometimes with an 8mm wrench, but most often it's a screwdriver. And the most important thing is not to lose it. So now the jet is clogged. We're not allowed to put anything into it. We can't use a piece of wire. We can't use a needle. The only thing we can use to unclog it is compressed air, or we can blow through it so that the dirt comes out from inside and clears it. If you start using wires, you will throw it out of calibration, and the motorcycle will never run the same again, at least not until you replace the jet with an original one. It won't run like it did before the malfunction. After cleaning and blowing it out, screw it back in, reassemble the carburetor completely. You put it onto the intake manifolds, assemble the air filter, and start it up. Of course, if you have more than one carburetor, the engine will start, but it will just run poorly. It will wobble, it won't run smoothly. The biggest problem is when, like in this motorcycle, we have only one carburetor. After blocking it, the engine shouldn't be able to start because it's not getting any fuel. While you're at it, it's a good idea to check other parts of the carburetor, such as the idle jet and the main jet. Everything here is extremely dirty, but we won't deal with that now because we're focusing on this motorcycle. As I mentioned, this carburetor is used only for educational purposes. Okay, we've cleaned the carburetor, we've cleaned the main jets, everything is assembled as it should be. The motorcycle still won't run. When we give it gas, the engine stalls. What should you do in this situation? The most common reason for this is a leak in the intake system, meaning a problem with the intake manifolds. The manifolds may be cracked, have holes, or be improperly installed. And here again, the choke can be our helper, maybe not always, but it can help. We engage it, then the fuel to air ratio should increase. If the throttle response improves, it means we have a leak. Often, the choke will be a great helper while riding. So, either the main jet is clogged, or you have a leak in the intake. The engine stalls, the engine chokes. You can't rev it up to ride, so pull the choke and you'll make it to town. You'll get to a service center, to a place where experienced mechanics will definitely help you. So remember, the choke can be your good friend, but also don't even think about riding every day with the choke on, because running too rich a mixture can damage the engine. That's all for this episode. In the next one, we'll focus on carburetor and valve adjustments. Take care and see you next time.